Crush in Lima. On May 24, 1964, Estadio Nacional in Lima, Peru held one of the most anticipated football matches in the country's recent memory. Peru was facing Argentina in an Olympic qualifying fixture, and the stakes were understood by everyone who filed through the stadium gates that afternoon. Estadio Nacional was the centerpiece of Peruvian football. Built to hold tens of thousands, it was the venue where the national team played its most important matches, where crowds gathered not just to watch sport, but to participate in something larger than themselves. On that Sunday in May, the stadium was filled well beyond comfortable capacity. Fans packed the terraces, the standing areas, the upper sections. The atmosphere before kickoff was charged with the particular energy of a match that meant something, a qualifier that could send Peru toward the Olympic Games. Vendors moved through the outer corridors. Families, young men, groups of friends had arrived early to secure their positions on the terraces. The afternoon light came down over the open bowl of the stadium as the match got underway. For much of the game, the crowd was loud and engaged. Peru and Argentina were evenly matched, and the tension that had been present before kickoff did not dissipate once play began. It built. Every close chance, every foul, every referee decision was amplified by the size of the crowd and the importance of the occasion. The terraces swayed with collective movement. The noise was constant. Then, late in the match, a Peruvian goal was disallowed. The referee ruled it out. The referee, Uruguayan Angel Eduardo Pazos, disallowed the equalizing goal due to a rough challenge by Peru's Victor Kilo Lobaton on an Argentine defender. But the effect on the crowd was immediate and violent. Sections of the terrace erupted. What had been collective tension became collective fury. Supporters began throwing objects. Portions of the crowd surged toward the barriers and the lower sections of the ground. Police responded by deploying tear gas inside the stadium. The gas entered an enclosed space holding tens of thousands of people. It spread through the terrace sections, reaching eyes and throats. Fans who had been standing in place began to move. Not toward exits in an organized way, but away from the gas, away from the burning, in every direction at once. The movement accelerated. Thousands of people were now pushing simultaneously through the internal corridors and toward the exits. The exits were locked. Fans reached the gates and found them sealed. The pressure from behind continued building as more people arrived at the same locked points. Those at the front had nowhere to go. They were pressed against steel and concrete by the weight of the crowd behind them. A crowd that could not see what was happening at the front. A crowd still moving forward. The crush intensified in the spaces just inside the locked gates. People fell. Those who fell were unable to rise. The crowd continued pressing. The weight became unsurvivable. Emergency services reached the stadium as reports of the scale of the disaster became clear. What responders found at the gate areas was a scene of mass casualties concentrated at the precise points where the exits had been sealed. Bodies were stacked against the doors. People who had been at the rear of the crush were still alive. People who had been at the front against the locked metal were not. The response involved police, military, and civilian emergency personnel working through the locked gate areas and across the terraces. The injured were carried out, transported to hospitals across Lima. The dead were documented where they fell. The full accounting took hours. The official death toll was confirmed at 328 people. Some sources recorded higher figures. 328 is the number that entered the historical record. It remains the highest confirmed death toll of any stadium disaster in history, exceeding Hillsborough, Bradford, Heysel, both Ibrox disasters and the Burned-in Park disaster combined. The cause was compression against locked exits, accelerated by tear gas deployed inside an enclosed crowd. Hailstorm in Kathmandu. On March 12, 1988, Dasarath Rangasala Stadium in Kathmandu, Nepal was hosting a football match that had drawn a significant crowd to the national ground. The stadium sat in the heart of the city, surrounded by the dense urban fabric of the Nepali capital, and on that afternoon it was filled with supporters who had come to watch the game under what appeared to be a normal late winter sky. Dasarath Rangasala was Nepal's principal football venue. The terraces and standing areas were packed, as they typically were for nationally significant fixtures. The crowd was diverse, men and women, older supporters and younger ones, people who had traveled into the city for the match. The atmosphere before and during the game was typical of a well-attended football afternoon. The terraces were open to the sky, as was standard for that era of stadium construction in the region. There was no roof over the standing areas. The match proceeded normally. The weather, as the game went on, began to shift. What arrived was not a gradual change in conditions. A sudden severe hailstorm broke over the stadium with very little warning. Large hailstones fell across the open terraces. Tens of thousands of people standing in exposed sections of the ground were struck directly by the falling ice. The pain was immediate. The instinct was universal. Every person in the open terraces moved at once toward shelter and toward the exits. The The crowd converged on the exit gates simultaneously. There was no organized evacuation, no announcement, no managed flow. The hailstorm drove people forward in every direction that pointed away from the open sky. The exits, which had been designed to handle the gradual dispersal of a crowd at the end of a match, were now receiving the entire stadium population in a single compressed surge. The exits were locked. Fans arrived at the gates moving fast, driven by the pain of the hailstones still falling behind them and the instinct to get through the door. The gates did not open. The people at the front pressed against the locked metal. The people behind them, still moving forward from the open terraces, did not yet know what was happening at the gates. The crush built from the front rapidly as the full weight of a panicked crowd concentrated on sealed exit points. People at the gate areas fell. The crowd behind continued arriving, driven forward by the storm. Those who fell could not be reached by the people around them. The compression at the locked points was total. Hailstones continued to fall across the terraces throughout the incident, which meant the pressure from the open sections toward the exits did not ease while the crush at the gates was developing. The two forces, the locked exits in front and the storm-driven crowd behind, held people in compression for the duration of the event. Emergency services responded when the scale of the disaster at the exits became apparent. Responders found the dead concentrated at the gate areas, at the precise points where locked doors had met a crowd with nowhere else to go. The injured were numerous. The response was conducted under extremely difficult conditions, with the weather still present and the crowd still partially in motion. 93 people were confirmed dead. The cause was compression at locked exits, following a crowd surge driven by the sudden hailstorm. Of all the disasters in the confirmed record of football, Kathmandu in 1988 is the only one in which the primary trigger was weather. The locked exits did the rest. Ibrox Stairway 13. On January 2, 1971, Ibrox Stadium in Glasgow, Scotland, was hosting the Old Firm, the fixture between Rangers and Celtic that carries more weight in Scottish football than any other match on the calendar. Ibrox was Rangers' ground, and the Old Firm drew capacity crowds without exception. On that cold January afternoon, the stadium was full. The Old Firm is not simply a football match. It is a cultural event, a tribal gathering, a fixture with historical and sectarian dimensions that make it unlike almost any other club game in world football. Supporters arrived at Ibrox carrying that weight. The atmosphere inside the ground was the specific atmosphere of an Old Firm. Loud, partisan, tightly wound. A crowd of tens of thousands organized along strict loyalty lines and occupying sections of the ground that corresponded with those loyalties. Stairway 13 was one of the main exit routes for a section of Rangers supporters. It was a steep, enclosed stairway, wide enough for crowd flow but known within the stadium's management history as a bottleneck. Prior to January 2nd, 1971, there had been incidents on Stairway 13. Not on the scale of what was about to happen, but incidents significant enough that the stairway's design had been flagged. That history had not produced structural change. Late in the match, Celtic scored. A portion of the Rangers' support, believing the game was lost, began to leave. Thousands of supporters moved toward the exits in the normal way, heading down Stairway 13 toward the street. The crowd flow on the stairway was moving in one direction, down and out. Then Rangers equalized. The response from the supporters was immediate. The roar went through the ground. The crowd flow on Stairway 13 was entirely one-directional, moving downward as thousands of exiting fans continued their descent toward the street. At the same time, the movement from inside the stadium toward the same stairway continued. The immense volume of thousands of fans trying to exit at the same time occupied the same narrow, steep space simultaneously, leaving absolutely no room to escape. The stairway could not accommodate the sheer density of the crowd, and when someone near the bottom tripped, it triggered a massive, compounding chain reaction collapse, where people fell. When someone falls on a crowded, steep stairway, the fall does not stop. People fell onto the people in front of them. Those people fell onto the people in front of them. The chain collapsed downward in a compression pile that the stairway's walls contained on both sides. There was no space to fall sideways, no room to roll clear, no gap for the people underneath to move. The weight of the crowd, still arriving from behind and above, continued pressing down onto the pile. People at the bottom of the stairway who had nowhere to go were crushed under the accumulated weight of dozens of bodies. Emergency services arrived at Ibrox as the disaster's scale became clear. The stairway was inaccessible until the crowd flow could be halted and reversed. Responders worked to reach those at the bottom of the pile, the people who had been there longest and under the most weight. Many of them were already dead. 66 people were confirmed dead. The cause was compression on a steep, enclosed stairway, precipitated by a catastrophic crowd collapse within a densely packed, single-direction flow of exiting fans. Stairway 13 was the site. The date was January 2nd, 1971. Fire at Bradford. On May 11th, 1985, Valley Parade Stadium in Bradford, England was hosting a third division match between Bradford City and Lincoln City. On its own, a third division end-of-season fixture would carry limited weight. On that specific Saturday, it carried something unusual: celebration. Bradford City had won the third division title, and the match against Lincoln City was the last home game of a championship season. The stadium was packed with supporters who had come to mark an achievement. Valley Parade was an old ground. The main stand, which would hold the majority of the seated supporters that afternoon, was a timber frame structure. Wood formed the substructure of the seating. The floor beneath the rows, the framework of the roof above. Over years of use, debris had accumulated in the void beneath the stand, rubbish blown in or dropped through gaps in the seating, built up in the enclosed space under the wooden floor. This had not been addressed. The crowd inside Valley Parade that afternoon was in good spirits. The title had already been won. The match was, in the emotional sense, a victory lap. Supporters had come to celebrate with the team, to see the trophy, to mark the end of a successful year. The atmosphere in the main stand was warm and festive. Families alongside the regular crowd, a slightly different demographic than a tense relegation fixture might bring. The match kicked off in the early afternoon. The celebrations continued from the pregame period. Bradford City supporters were enjoying themselves. Smoke was first noticed rising from beneath the seating in the main stand during the first half. The smoke was visible before the fire was. A few supporters noticed it, a thin column rising from under the wooden floor. At the pace it appeared initially, it did not seem like an emergency. But the fire below the stand had access to years of accumulated rubbish and dry timber. It had been burning long enough before it was noticed to have established itself. What happened next happened in under 4 minutes. The fire moved through the accumulated debris beneath the stand and reached the wooden structure above it. The timber of the subfloor caught. The wooden seating caught. The roof caught. What had been a contained fire beneath the floor became, in a matter of seconds, a fire that occupied the entire stand from floor to ceiling. Supporters in the main stand realized simultaneously that the fire was not a small incident. The smoke was thick and black. The flames were visible and moving fast. People began to move toward the exits at the front of the stand, toward the pitch, and toward the exits at the rear. Some of the rear exits were locked or obstructed. The fire was moving faster than the crowd. People at the rear of the stand encountered locked exits while the fire was already above them. The wooden roof was fully involved. Burning material fell. People who could not get through the rear exits moved toward the front, toward the pitch, some of them already on fire. Other spectators in the open sections of the ground watched the main stand burn. Supporters on the pitch attempted to help those coming out of the stand. The fire services were called and responded, but the speed of the fire meant that by the time they arrived, the stand had already been consumed. 56 people were confirmed dead. The cause was fire, accelerated by the timber construction of the main stand and the accumulated debris beneath the seating. The 4-minute window between the fire becoming visible and the stand being fully involved was not sufficient time for an unmanaged evacuation of a full seated stand with obstructed rear exits. Valley Parade's main stand was rebuilt. Timber frame stands were subsequently banned in English football. Collapse at Heysel. On May 29, 1985, Heysel Stadium in Brussels, Belgium was the venue for the European Cup final, the most prestigious fixture in club football at that time. The two clubs competing were Liverpool of England and Juventus of Italy. A European Cup final draws supporters from two countries, and Heysel that evening held a crowd of approximately 58,000 people. Heysel Stadium had been selected for the final, despite concerns about its condition. The ground was old. The infrastructure had deteriorated. Sections of the crowd barriers and retaining walls were described by observers as dilapidated. The stadium had not been modernized to the standard that a match of this scale and the crowd it would attract demanded. Those concerns did not prevent the fixture from being assigned there. The ground was divided into sections for each set of supporters. A neutral zone, designated Block Z, sat between a section allocated to Liverpool supporters and the end of the ground, where Juventus supporters were concentrated. Block Z was occupied primarily by Juventus supporters and general ticket holders who would obtain tickets through various channels. Before the match kicked off, a section of Liverpool supporters charged toward Block Z. The Juventus supporters and neutral ticket holders in Block Z moved away from the charge. They moved in the only direction available to them, away from the approaching group, and toward the retaining wall at the far end of the section. The crowd compressed rapidly against that wall. The wall gave way. The retaining wall, described in subsequent accounts as old and structurally inadequate, could not absorb the weight of hundreds of people pressing against it under crowd pressure. It collapsed. People fell. People who had been standing against the wall fell through it and onto the ground below. People who had been behind them fell on top of them. Approximately 600 people were injured in the incident. The match was played after the disaster. UEFA officials and authorities on the ground made the decision to proceed with the final rather than abandon it, in the assessment that abandoning the match might cause further disorder. Liverpool lost to Juventus on a penalty. 39 people were confirmed dead. The cause was the collapse of the retaining wall, precipitated by the crowd surge in Block Z. In the aftermath of Heysel, all English clubs were banned from European competition. The ban lasted 5 years for most clubs, 6 for Liverpool. Heysel Stadium was subsequently demolished and replaced. The disaster, alongside Bradford, which had occurred 2 weeks earlier, fundamentally shifted the conversation about stadium safety across the continent. Locked gates, Accra. On May 9, 2001, Accra Sports Stadium in the Ghanaian capital was hosting a football match between Hearts of Oak and Asante Kotoko. These two clubs represent the central rivalry in Ghanaian football, the fixture around which the country's footballing identity organizes itself. When Hearts of Oak and Asante Kotoko play, the stadium fills. On May 9th, approximately 60,000 people were inside Accra Sports Stadium. The stadium had been built to hold large crowds, but 60,000 people pressed into a ground designed for a lower capacity created conditions of extreme density in the standing sections. The terraces were tightly packed. Movement within the crowd was limited. The match carried the particular atmospheric weight that the Hearts and Kotoko fixture always carried. Tension, noise, partisanship. A crowd that cared deeply about the outcome. Late in the match, Kotoko were trailing. The result was not going their way. In the final minutes, sections of the Kotoko support began reacting to the situation on the pitch. Objects were thrown. Seats were damaged. Sections of the crowd became disorderly. Police inside the stadium responded by deploying tear gas. The gas was released inside an enclosed space holding approximately 60,000 people. It reached multiple sections of the crowd simultaneously. The effect was instantaneous. 60,000 people began to move away from the gas at the same time, toward the exits, toward any opening that promised air and escape. The exits were locked. The mass of 60,000 people converging on sealed gates produced a compression force at every locked exit point that overwhelmed anyone caught between the crowd and the gate. People at the front were pressed against locked metal by the weight of tens of thousands of people behind them. People who could not see the gates, people still moving forward, people still driven by the tear gas burning in their eyes and throats. At each locked gate, the scene was the same. The dead were found in the areas immediately adjacent to the sealed exits, where the crowd pressure had been at its maximum. The injured were throughout the outer sections of the stadium. The scale was enormous. Emergency services arrived and worked through the exit areas. The locked gates were opened once authorities on the ground grasped what was happening, but by that point the crush had already done what it would do. The response involved Ghanaian police, military and civilian emergency personnel. Hospitals across Accra received the injured throughout the night. 126 people were confirmed dead. The cause was compression at locked exits following a mass crowd surge triggered by tear gas deployed inside an occupied stadium. May 9th, 2001 was the deadliest day in the history of Ghanaian football. World Cup qualifier Guatemala on October 16, 1996. Estadio Mateo Flores in Guatemala City was scheduled to host a FIFA World Cup qualifying match between Guatemala and Costa Rica. A World Cup qualifier in the host nation's capital generates significant demand. The tickets that had been officially printed and distributed for this fixture were not the only tickets in circulation in Guatemala City on that day. Counterfeit tickets had been produced and sold in large quantities in the days before the match. Supporters who believed they held valid entry documents arrived at Estadio Mateo Flores expecting to be admitted. When the legitimate ticketed crowd had filled the stadium to its official capacity, thousands of additional supporters were still outside or still entering, holding counterfeit documents that the turnstiles could not distinguish from real ones in the volume of the crowd that was pressing forward. Estadio Mateo Flores could not hold what was being pushed into it. The stadium's capacity was a number that the crowd moving through its gates that afternoon was going to exceed by a significant margin. The standing sections filled beyond any reasonable limit. People in the terraces were tightly pressed. New arrivals continued entering because the counterfeit ticket problem meant that no accurate accounting of the crowd size was possible until it was too late. The pre-match atmosphere inside an overfull stadium for a World Cup qualifier against a regional rival was loud and tightly compressed. The standing sections offered almost no individual space. Movement was already restricted before the match began. The crowd, having paid for their places and having traveled to the ground, was committed to being there. Those who felt uncomfortable had nowhere easy to go. The crush developed in the standing sections. As the density exceeded the threshold that human bodies can withstand without injury, people began to fall. A crowd at a certain pressure does not fall down. It compresses. The people at the lowest points, at the front of the standing sections, at the bottom of the packed terraces, bore the accumulated weight of everyone behind and above them. They could not breathe. They could not move. The crowd pressing down from above and behind did not know, could not know, what was happening at the bottom of the section. Emergency services were called and responded to the stadium. What they found in the standing sections was casualties distributed across the packed terraces, with the highest concentrations of fatalities at the lowest points. The front rows, where the compression had been most severe and sustained. The injured numbered 147. The dead had been crushed in the sections built to hold ordinary standing supporters at an ordinary football match. 84 people were confirmed dead. 147 were injured. The cause was overcrowding, driven by counterfeit tickets that had pushed crowd density past any survivable level in the standing sections. The date was October 16, 1996, a World Cup qualifying evening in Guatemala City. Soviet cover-up, Moscow. On October 20th, 1982, Luzhniki Stadium in Moscow was hosting a UEFA Cup match between Spartak Moscow and HFC Haarlem of the Netherlands. It was a cold October evening. The crowd was not at full capacity, as the Soviet state had not heavily promoted the match, and the conditions were not welcoming for standing outside. Those who were there were committed supporters, gathered in one of the Soviet Union's flagship sporting venues for a European club fixture. Luzhniki was one of the largest and most significant stadiums in the Soviet Union, a venue built to project national strength, used for international competition, tightly controlled by state authorities. On an October night for a UEFA Cup match, it was not the full spectacle that major Soviet sporting occasions produced, but it operated under the same institutional framework, the same chain of authority, the same relationship between the state, the stadium, and the information that came out of it. The match was proceeding in cold, icy conditions. Some supporters, as the game wound toward its conclusion, began to leave early. This was ordinary crowd behavior on a cold night for a match that did not have the draw of a full capacity occasion. Sections of the crowd in one part of the ground made their way toward an exit stairway, moving in the normal direction, down and out into the Moscow night. The stairway was icy, then Spartak scored. The goal, late in the match, prompted an immediate reaction from those inside the ground. The crowd was funneled into a single, ice-covered exit staircase under heavily restrictive police monitoring, where a spectator lost a shoe and tripped, causing a catastrophic domino effect among the thousands moving downward. Simultaneously, supporters still inside the stadium, responding to the same goal, were moving toward the exits. The single massive crowd flow buckled under intense physical pressure on the stadium's Grand Arena Staircase R, people moving down, those being packed tightly from behind, and thousands more still arriving from the top were all trapped on a steep, ice-covered stairway with no room to separate. Because of the slick conditions, the physical compression instantly worsened as hundreds of cascading bodies piled up on the frozen steps. Bodies collected at the lower sections of the stairway, and the crowd from above continued arriving without knowledge of what was happening below them. The crush at the bottom of the stairway, on an icy surface in the cold and dark, killed 66 people. The Soviet state's response to the disaster extended beyond emergency services. State media reported the incident minimally. A small notice appeared in the Soviet press. The full scale of the deaths was not reported. The institutional machinery that controlled information in the Soviet Union was applied to the disaster at Luzhniki, and it worked. For years, the deaths of 66 people at a football match in the Soviet Union's most prominent stadium were effectively suppressed. Some sources have suggested the actual death toll was higher than 66, the number the state admitted. The full toll was never officially confirmed. The details did not emerge fully until the Glasnost era, when the loosening of Soviet information controls allowed accounts of the disaster to circulate more openly. By that point, years had passed since October 20th, 1982. 66 people were confirmed dead, by the Soviet state's own count. The cause was a crush on an icy stairway following a domino effect stumble within a heavily restricted crowd flow under aggressive police monitoring. The cover-up was confirmed as historical fact. Tear gas at Kanjuruhan. On October 1st, 2022, Kanjuruhan Stadium in Malang, East Java, Indonesia, was hosting a league match between Arema FC and Persebaya Surabaya. The fixture was a significant one, a rivalry between two clubs from East Java with a passionate and historically intense supporter culture. Kanjuruhan was Arema's home ground, and the home crowd was present in large numbers. The stadium held tens of thousands of supporters. The atmosphere for a match of this weight in front of a home crowd with a strong identity was charged from well before kickoff. Arema supporters, known as Aramania, were a prominent and organized presence in the stadium. The match itself was competitive and high stakes in the way that a close rivalry always is. Arema lost. The final whistle confirmed the defeat, and for a portion of the home support, the result was not acceptable. Sections of Aremania descended from the stands and moved onto the pitch. The number of supporters on the pitch grew. Police inside the stadium moved to address the situation. Officers fired tear gas. The gas was deployed not only toward the pitch, but into the stands, into sections of the stadium still occupied by thousands of supporters who had not moved, who were not on the pitch, who had done nothing to precipitate a police response. The tear gas reached the stands. What followed was the immediate, simultaneous movement of thousands of people away from the gas and toward the exits. The crowd in the stands did not move in an organized way. They moved in the only way a crowd that is being gassed in an enclosed space can move, fast, in panic, all at once, toward any exit. Kanjuruhan's exits could not handle the sudden volume. The exit routes became compression zones. People fell at the exits. People were crushed. People were asphyxiated in the dense compression at the gates. The crowd was enormous, the exits were insufficient for an emergency evacuation, and the tear gas was still present in the air of the stadium, still pushing people forward, still generating the panic that was killing people at the far end of the movement. Emergency services responded to Kanjuruhan Stadium as the scale of the disaster became clear. The response involved Indonesian police, military, and medical personnel. Hospitals in Malang and across East Java received the injured in large numbers throughout the night. The dead were documented in the exit areas and in the crush zones. 135 people were confirmed dead. The figure in early reports varied, with some accounts citing higher numbers. 135 is the final official number confirmed by health authorities after correcting initial reporting errors. Hundreds more were injured. In the aftermath, multiple Indonesian police officers were charged and subsequently convicted for their role in the disaster. FIFA's regulations explicitly prohibit the use of crowd control gas in stadiums. Those regulations had not been followed at Kanjuruhan. October 1st, 2022 became the deadliest stadium disaster of the 21st century. Locked gates, Hillsborough. On April 15, 1989, Hillsborough Stadium in Sheffield, England was the designated neutral venue for an FA Cup semi-final between Liverpool and Nottingham Forest. A neutral ground semi-final draws supporters from two cities to a third. Both sets of fans had been allocated sections of the ground. Liverpool supporters were assigned the Leppings Lane end behind the goal, which consisted of standing pens divided by metal fencing into sections that ran from the back of the terrace to the perimeter fence at the pitch. The standing pens at the Leppings Lane end were a feature of the era. Anti-hooligan fencing, installed at grounds across England through the 1980s, was designed to prevent pitch invasions. It ran along the front of the standing sections, a metal barrier between the crowd and the pitch surface, tall enough and constructed in a way that meant it could not be easily climbed or breached. In 1989, it was a standard fixture at major English football grounds. Hillsborough's Leppings Lane Terrace was divided into several pens, but the central pens, positioned directly behind the goal, were accessible by a tunnel entrance from the concourse that funneled supporters naturally into the center. The outer lateral pens to either side were less obviously reached from the main concourse. This layout meant that crowd flow entering through the tunnel consistently went to the central pens, rather than distributing evenly across all sections. Liverpool supporters began arriving at Leppings Lane in the hours before kickoff. The concourse outside Leppings Lane was a bottleneck. The turnstile capacity relative to the number of supporters attempting to enter was insufficient for the rate at which the crowd was arriving. By 3 o'clock kickoff time, the concourse outside was severely congested. A dangerous crush was developing outside the stadium. South Yorkshire Police, responsible for crowd management at the fixture, had a decision to make. To relieve the pressure on the concourse outside, they requested permission to open Gate C, a large exit gate in the perimeter wall that gave directly onto the Leppings Lane concourse. Permission was given, Gate C was opened. Approximately 2,000 additional supporters entered through Gate C. They entered the concourse and moved toward the ground. The tunnel in front of them led to the central pens. The central pens were already full, having received the majority of supporters who had entered before Gate C opened. The new arrivals moved down the tunnel and into the pens because that was where the tunnel led, because there was no indication that those pens were beyond capacity, and because no one directed them toward the lateral pens. The central pens filled past survivable density. Supporters at the front of the central pens, those who had arrived earliest and had positioned themselves close to the perimeter fencing, were the first to feel the pressure from behind. The crowd behind them was dense, compacted, growing. The perimeter fencing in front of them did not move. It had been built not to move. The space between the crowd and the fence contracted as the density increased. People at the front could not breathe. They could not turn around. They could not fall without being held upright by the bodies around them. The pressure was from every direction except the fence in front of them, which held its position and held the crowd against itself. People began to die standing up. Emergency services were called. Police officers inside the ground took time to recognize the crush at the front of the pens as a crowd emergency rather than a disorder incident, a distinction that delayed the response and was later documented extensively in the inquests and independent reviews that followed. Fans climbed the perimeter fencing to escape. Others were dragged over the top by supporters in the upper tier. Advertising boards were torn down and used as improvised stretchers to carry the unconscious out of the pens. The ambulance response to Hillsborough was documented as inadequate. Senior officers on the ground failed to declare a major incident promptly. Access for medical personnel onto the pitch was restricted. The timeline of the response from the point when the crush became apparent to the point when appropriate emergency medical resources were fully deployed was examined in detail across multiple official inquiries over the 3 decades that followed. 97 people were confirmed dead. The final death, the 97th, occurred in 2021, when a man who had been in a permanent vegetative state since the day of the disaster died 32 years after April 15, 1989. The deaths were ruled unlawful killings. South Yorkshire Police's failure to manage the crowd safely at Leppings Lane was established as the cause. The initial account promoted by South Yorkshire Police, which placed blame on Liverpool supporters, was comprehensively disproven by the Hillsborough Independent Panel in 2012 and confirmed false in subsequent legal proceedings. Anti-hooligan perimeter fencing was removed from English football grounds in the aftermath of the disaster. If you want to see more, click the video on screen now.